Okay, well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming to our talk about who decides. You know, that's not a simple question. The four of us are members of a group called Kidlit for Growing Minds, and we write fiction and nonfiction and informational fiction, trying to help children become better children than better adults, not by being didactic, but by writing books that they're interested in. But who decides? Is it the community, you know, the PTA, the parents? Is it the librarians, it's the educators? You know, who decides what books children get to read? Is it the gatekeepers from our business, you know, the publishers, the agents, the editors? Or is it us, the authors? Are we deciding what to write about? So we're going to look into a little bit more about all of those things. But first, how about if we introduce who we are? And Beth, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I'm Beth Anderson. I'm a former educator. I taught ESL for 22 years, and now I write books that I would love to have had in my classroom. So here's a quick intro. An Inconvenient Alphabet, Ben Franklin and Noah Webster's Spelling Revolution. Lizzie Demands a Seat, Elizabeth Jennings Fights for Streetcar Rights. Smelly Kelly and His Super Senses, How James Kelly's Nose Saved the New York City Subway. Tad Lincoln's Restless Wriggle, Pandemonium and Patience in the President's House. And this year's titles, we got 2 out so far: Revolutionary Prudence Wright, Leading the Minutewomen in the Fight for Independence, and May's release, Franz's Phantasmagorical Machine. So these are all true stories. A couple of them are slightly historical fiction. I go for as much truth as I can possibly do to tell the story.
Okay, Keela?
Sure. My name is Keela Dawson, and I too am a former educator turned picture book author. I write fiction and nonfiction picture books, and these are my books here in the back. My debut book was a fiction story, The King Cake Baby, because I'm from New Orleans. And No Voice Too Small is my 2020 title, which is a poetry anthology about true stories about living children who are making a difference in their lives as activists. And today I'll probably talk more about Opening the Road, which is my nonfiction book from 2021. And I've worked and lived in several different countries and in different parts of the United States. And I continue to work and especially travel abroad because I enjoy learning about history, about people, and about different cultures. I'm a native of New Orleans, like I said, and today I live in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Okay, Rita, and unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rita Lorraine Hubbard. I live in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I also am a former educator of 20 years, taught exceptional children from gifted all the way to the other end of the spectrum, children who were challenged. I'm the author of The Oldest Student, which actually debuted 2 years ago, and then Hammering for Freedom, which debuted in 2018. I love all things history. As a matter of fact, almost my entire year this year has been taken up with a documentary that is being produced here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I was brought on to this documentary as the lead historical researcher and have learned so much about pulling a documentary / movie together. But all things history, that's where I am. And glad to be here, by the way.
And again, I'm Lori Walmark. Most of my books are picture book biographies of women in STEM. And again, you can see them behind me. Maybe, you know, Grace Hopper, Queen of Computer Code. My latest is a book whose name has totally escaped my mind. So there you go. But you can, I forgot to say earlier that if you look on our Kidlit for Growing Minds website, It has links to all of our personal websites, which tell about our books and tell about teacher guides that are available, activity guides, things like that. But I also write fiction picture books. So my latest is Dino Pajama Party, which is not, as some people have asked, nonfiction, because as far as we know, dinos did not wear pajamas. So let's get right into this. So our first question, which is related to the gatekeeper, as an author, there's a lot to think about when deciding on a subject or topic. What are a couple of things you consider as you begin a project? And Rita, let's start with you this time.
Okay, make sure I'm unmuted. I am. Of course, the very first thing is whether the topic is relatable to the children, if it's even something they would enjoy, relate to, or identify with. That's the very first thing that I think of, because as I said, I love all things history, and I run into so many stories of truly unsung heroes, but every story does not translate into a picture book for children. So that's the very first thing I think about. And then whether something that the main character is experiencing, whether it will kind of be a universal experience that children can actually see themselves, even if the main character is older, like in my book, The Oldest Student. Can these students see themselves experiencing this, or do they remember experiencing something similar to that? Those are the first things that I think of before I even begin a story.
Okay, Keila?
Well, I consider myself a lifelong learner. And when I hear a story about a person, event, or a period of time, I have to decide if it has a wow factor. Do I want to know more about this topic or person? And if it has a why factor, why didn't I know this story or know about this event? Why is this unknown to me? So I tend to write about topics so kids can be better informed than I was at my age, and maybe even better informed than some adults, actually. I feel like writing nonfiction stories makes us a part of the guardian force of historic facts. And we're on a mission to battle misinformation and disinformation. Because the true stories that we tell disrupt the narrative that's often told. I will never argue with someone's personal experiences, but I will, and I can argue how their truths and their perceptions are based on historical fact. I will ask, how would the story help kids understand the world in which we live? How is using information from the past going to help them prepare for a better future?
Okay, Beth?
Well, my first question for myself is, am I passionate about the subject? Because if I don't feel an emotional connection to it, it won't matter to anybody else either. And then I look at the kid connection. Is there a hook for them? Like Rita was saying, is it meaningful to kids today? And does this story matter? And then for all practical purposes, you have to really ask, is it marketable? So you're kind of I'm kind of looking at myself, the kids' audience, and the publisher. But overall, I write what I write because of my experience as an educator. And for me, it's about something that will widen a child's world, deepen understanding, and connect them, something that will connect to them and their lives and the world around them.
And I, of course, could say ditto, ditto, ditto to what everyone else said. But in addition, why do I write about women in STEM? Because I love science and math. So you get that passion that Beth just talked about, because I'm passionate about science and math, and I want to share that passion with children. I choose scientists and mathematicians. Why women? Because they are so very underrepresented in biographies. It's better right now, it's getting better. But when I was a kid, you would have thought my name had to be Marie Curie if I wanted to be a scientist, because that was the only woman scientist I knew about. So we are the first level of gatekeepers by choosing what we write about, our interests, our passions, what we think children will be interested in, and then it has to go through all the other gates. So why is it necessary to move past popular or traditional historical figures and views? We can connect with our book characters, topics, events, things like that. Why do we need to get past George Washington and Ben Franklin? Keela.
Well, I consider myself a well-educated person who loves history, but I am also aware of the gaps in my own knowledge. So one year, in the way back when I was a teacher, I was tasked to create a school bulletin board. And it was Black History Month, so I decided to research Black heroes and share some who were, above and beyond the notable leaders that we had learned about. Yet I only learned about Victor Hugo Green's story in 2017, but even before the Green Book movie, by listening to the radio. And how he wrote his Green Book to help African-American motorists travel during legal segregation. So people like Victor Hugo Green existed, they resisted, and they changed millions of lives. So they should be part of the historical record too. Just like Lori talked about the women who are missing from history stories. But I bet most schools only study Black history during February, when it's actually part of the fabric of our historical stories. So missing in untold stories like Victor's, I love them. And I want other kids to hear about them too.
Exactly. Beth?
Well, I think seeing a narrow path really limits our thinking about who and what are valuable and important, and also what's possible. We like to talk to kids all the time about thinking outside the box, but how is that possible if we never learn anything outside the box? I think that most of us don't see ourselves as members of this elite, who make it into the history books. We have very different life experiences. And so stories like Revolutionary Prudence Wright and Lizzie Demands a Seat show kids that everyday people matter and that the decisions they make can really have a lasting impact. Because if we don't see ourselves reflected in the books we read, then it's really hard to believe that we matter. And I think if we don't see the capableness of others that are different than us, then it's hard to believe they matter. So it really goes both ways. I think stories allow kids not only to see their own agency, but to also recognize that in others. And if you think of like a family, does the father represent the whole family? To understand a family, we need to hear from every member. And I think one person's story never tells the whole story. Every kid knows that when you have a little fight with your brother or sister, when they go tell mom or dad what happened, their versions are different because they each saw it differently. And so really whatever a person's race or gender or age or education or ability or wealth, we all have the potential to make a difference. And the more voices and the more experiences raise more possibilities.
Rita?
Well, I grew up hearing the phrase, one size does not fit all, but yet I grew up seeing the powers that be trying to make one size fit all, trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. I didn't see any representatives of my own race or gender in the books that I grew up with. And by the time I became a teacher, and my very first class was a class of at-risk children who were actually had failed 2 or 3 times. So they were much older than the grade level they were in, they had no heroes of their own. And I kept thinking, we say one size does not fit all. What can we do about it? I think the world now, the whole world is coming to that crossroads where we finally realize everybody's different, everybody looks different, people look different, smell different, speak differently, think differently. We're finally coming to that point. But I think as writers, we need to keep pushing that point, whether the world can keep up with our pace or not, because as has been mentioned on this panel, these children need to see a representative of themselves, not just in color, but in gender also, especially girls. And I know we've been emphasizing that, but girls need to know that they really can do anything that they set their minds to. One size does not fit all.
And I'm going to answer with an anecdote. And this anecdote is from a book festival. And I was sitting next to Emma Teggy, who's a wonderful, wonderful writer. And she had written a picture book biography of the person who wrote the song Guantanamera. He was a poet. And I was there with one or two of my Women in STEM books. So people would be walking along. They go, depending upon which way they were coming, hit one of us, then hit the next of us. And if they hit me first, they'd say, "Oh, this book looks really good, but I have a boy." And I'd say, "But boys need to learn about this too. Boys need to know that girls can do things and grow up to be scientists." Never worked. Then they'd move over to Emma and they'd say, "Oh, this book looks great, but I'm not Latino." It was sort of that same thing, that people were not seeing that their children need to, what Rita said, they need to see all sides of this picture, to be able to walk in other people's shoes, the mirrors and windows, see themselves reflected. Certainly, you definitely need that. But you also need to be able to walk through that window, see through that window and see people who are not like you, to know that they can be leaders, they can do these important things, they can do anything. And when children grow up to be adults, they're going to be working together with people who are not like them, either gender, race, ethnicity, language, whatever it is. This is why we do it. I think this is true for all of us. But now comes the hard question. Why is it important? Oops, wrong question. Yes, right question. Would help if I could read. Why is it important for us to learn about and visit history that we may not be proud of? And how about Beth? Let's start with you.
Well, think of it this way. What if a child brought home their papers from school and only showed their parents the good grades and threw away their failures or the ones where they didn't score so well? Would their parents agree that they only wanted to see the good stuff? And just think about what a child learns from that. You learn to only share the good stuff and hide the bad stuff. And with history, we can't pick out the pieces we like and pretend the others don't exist either. As individuals and a society, we learn from mistakes. Don't we want our kids to be able to admit when they've lost or made a mistake or made a harmful decision? How do you ever move forward if you can't do that? So I think that being able to look at the past and see what was wrong or misguided or downright inhumane really opens up that door to understanding how beliefs and attitudes and fears impact our lives. Because context of time and place is so essential when you're talking about history. And it provides a model for looking at today, but it's also a safe distance from the past so you can examine it freely. So I think stories are really a safe place for learning about the world and for practicing critical thinking and decision-making for now.
Kayla?
Well, I think of history as a collection of stories, and you put those pieces together and it creates a picture. So imagine having a puzzle and you're missing the pieces. I know how upsetting that is. I've had children completing puzzles and the pieces just aren't there. So we have to ask ourselves, for what reasons have these stories been excluded? Why are they missing? And it also, when we include everyone in our historical record, what we're doing is we are giving credit where credit is due. And we disrupt the thinking that only one group gets the credit and therefore in some way are magically superior to another, when it's just not true. So it also disrupts that argument of both sides of the story, which is a slippery slope. And one of the things that our books will do is not only challenge that idea, but they're so well researched that we have the receipts. We have the primary and secondary sources, and those stories can help prepare students, teachers, and gatekeepers to defend their position for that argument, which is, I understand, a common argument today.
Rita?
Well, I have to agree with Akila on the puzzle scenario. I've thought of that often myself. What if you have been working so hard on a 1,000-piece puzzle and there's this great big gaping hole in the middle of it, and you look everywhere and you can't find the other pieces? It's so frustrating. So and she's already said that, but I had to elaborate because I've thought of that myself before. But I feel that it is important for us to, or for children to learn about and visit history, especially the parts that we may not be proud of, because it gives them a better, fuller, and truer picture of the real world, the real world, and how it went from what it was, what they learned it was, to what it is today. Something's missing in the middle. I think it'll give them just a truer picture of the real world.
And I think we can all agree that right now we're in a time period where people are trying to shove away pieces of history.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why books become even more important, because children can read that history. I'm going to ask a question which we didn't talk about beforehand. So, if panel members say pass, that's fine. But I just thought of it right now. What about, let's say right after World War II or during World War II, you're the only German child in the class, or right after, let's say World War II, you're the only German child in the class. So you are learning about the history of World War II and what the Germans did, and everyone is staring at you because you are the only child. You have represented the millions of other Germans around the world, just sitting there, in your little desk. What happens to children then? And I'm not going to call on anyone, because since I didn't think of this question until now, does anyone have any suggestions?
I think that comes down to stereotypes and individual versus group thinking, that we are all different. Even though we might have the same labels as somebody else, it doesn't mean we're the same. We think the same. And to make that point, you can start to break down stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think that we need to become more comfortable with the uncomfortable. And I think oftentimes stories aren't shared because maybe people don't realize their own biases. People are not aware of the history. They may have been given that same information over and over and over and over, that they believe it to be true. You repeat the same thing so many times.
It magically becomes true, yes.
Exactly. And it's not like people over time have not changed their views. I mean, we're seeing that today where people thought they were misled, they were whatever, but you know, it is possible for people to change. And I think education, information, and receipts help.
Well, I want to add one thing. So what you described was me, only I wasn't German.
Right,
I was
exactly. You might be the only
African-American.
Black child in the
Yes.
class,
Oh,
the
I
only
was.
Asian child.
Oh, I was
right
the
now.
only Black. Well, I was the only Black child in my 5th grade and 6th grade class, and in my 7th grade class. And I will simply say, this is a reason we need more writers of courage, not just writers of courage and publishers of courage, because at the time that I was the only Black girl in certain classes, yeah, I felt alone. I sure did. Some people were nice to me, some were not, but I did feel alone because there was nothing that looked like me at all, absolutely at all. But just think if there may have been writers with courage, but publishers of courage. Somebody's got to get started. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Somebody's got to start it, but there was nothing for me to gravitate to. So I just had to throw that in because you described me.
Right, and that relates back to our gatekeeper, where we started, that if agents are not choosing to publish people, you know, writers of color, let's use, we're using you as an example, sorry, Rita.
No.
You know, and they'll say, well, it's because editors are not going to accept the book. And the editors will say, well, because people will not buy the book.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it turns out, you know what, not to be true, that people do buy books by, you know, people of color. People do buy books about different countries and stuff. You know, it's not true.
Yeah.
But
and Lori, I wanted to share that I was doing research years ago when the We Need Diverse Books campaign started, and they had a link to a story by Walter Dean Myers, and it was the history of how he became published. And when a group of writers wanted to write stories about their experiences, specifically African-American experiences, they were told there were no Black writers. And so what happened was, you know, they ran this contest. They formed a group and they ran this contest, and they got hundreds of submissions from people, you know, and it's that same argument. It's like the gatekeeper is going to tell you this doesn't exist. You know, there are no women in history that, you know, kids should know about. Yeah, let me prove you wrong. Look at all the books you've published, you know? So there's always going to be that resistance from gatekeepers, and you just have to find a way to power through.
And I just put into the chat the website for We Need Diverse Books. It is a great organization. They help get the word out, but in addition, they do mentorships and scholarships. You know, so it's definitely a good organization to know. But yeah, so when we think of banned books, we think of it, you know, all these community members who are banning books, which is certainly true. I mean, 2 of my books have been banned. You know, what, white woman in history shouldn't be smart? You know, I'm white, so it's not me. You know, I'm not a person of color. My people who were banned happen to be white. So all I'm left with is that women shouldn't be smart. So you don't know what the community is going to want to ban. You know, we know the general outline of what they're banning, but it starts earlier. You know, Rita said it, you need writers with courage to write these books and not think, oh, it can never get published. You know, that's where it starts with the writers. That is a wonderful, wonderful phrase. And I love that. And I'm going to steal it because that's what we do.
But I'll add one thing there. I think that when you talk story, you are connecting on an emotional level. And that goes through everyone, you know. So
Absolutely.
everyone is able to connect to every story if that emotional arc is there.
I took a webinar about adding emotion to stories. And the person giving the webinar, Pat Zietlow-Miller, who's a wonderful writer, someone asked the question, what about nonfiction? And Pat threw me under the bus and said, well, Lori's here at the webinar. Let's ask Lori. But the answer is what we've all said. Having a passion about that subject comes through in what we're writing so that the kids feel that passion about the subject. You know, you're a history person, Rita. You know, that history is going to come through no matter what. I'm a science and math person. That's going to come through no matter what. Okay, I need to keep moving along here. So how are your characters deciders? How do they serve children and help them become critical thinkers, problem solvers, and empathetic humans? And let's start with Rita.
Okay, I was hoping you wouldn't start with me, but I'm fine.
I'm trying to mix it up.
No, that's okay. I'm fine with that. So in The Oldest Student, Mary was a decider from the beginning. When she was a little girl, she decided, I'm going to learn to read one day. But what I found in her story was, even though she was a decider and she knew that's what she was going to do, she hadn't decided when she was going to do it. So she kept putting more and more priorities in front of that one thing. It was not until the moment when she said, no more waiting, time to learn. Once she said that, she became officially a decider. And I feel like she can help children, just that one line can help children because they may have, well, many of their decisions may be out of their hands because they're children, but those things that are within their power at their fingertips, they can make the decision when it's time. No more talking, no more procrastinating, no more coloring all day and forgetting about it. Time to do whatever, fill in the blank. So I felt like that one moment was what turned the whole story. It was like the midpoint of the whole story. And it's the same thing with a child's life. Whatever you do have control over, not only can you decide to do that thing, but you can decide when. Are you going to start now? Or are you going to start tomorrow? You decide when.
A really good point. I like that. Kayla?
Well, as I wrote Opening the Road, I thought a lot about Victor Green's motivation. His goal is part of the historical record, okay? Segregation limited the spaces that welcomed him. And he wanted to find a way around those roadblocks. His action, his ongoing dedication over the almost 30 years he published, and how he accomplished that goal, though, makes him a role model. And his decisions show a lot about Victor Green's character, his beliefs, and his dreams. So it took courage in the 1930s, throughout the 60s, highly dangerous time for him and his community to travel. It took community because he didn't act alone. To gather all the information for his book, even for the people who offered lodging where there were no hotels that welcomed African Americans. I mean, those are people who also were very courageous and did something that was going to help their community. It took commitment. He expanded and updated his guide every year, adding more and more states, so more and more people could travel to more and more places. So kids are certainly familiar with the before studying at home, during the pandemic, and after they went back to school. So a story like Opening the Road and many of our stories are good examples of the cause and effect of change. So readers can understand why Victor decided to do what he did, why he decided to act, and what influenced and kept him going. Because kids can feel what his life was like before and after he wrote his travel guides.
Beth?
Well, all the characters that I've written about, I think could be seen as less than due to gender or race or education or age, but they all somehow found their voice and were able to see possibility. So like in Lizzie Demands a Seat, when Elizabeth Jennings, in that moment, she lets kids see how her world shaped her, and the readers are there as she makes her crucial decision. So I think that with something like that, you know, I'm a person who sometimes is sort of stunned and unable to react when given a situation. And so this kind of gives kids a way to practice thinking through and what they would do and imagining themselves dealing with it. In Tad Lincoln's Restless Wriggle, he's basically an unruly child who has speech and learning disabilities, and everybody thinks he's just trouble.
Mhm.
But readers can witness how the guidance from his father brings Tad to the point to make better decisions, and decisions that allow others to appreciate his good heart and his goodness. In a Revolutionary Prudence Right, readers can see a woman at the start of the revolution who decided to push back fear and defy tradition by leading the first group of Minute Women, because the need was there and she just did it without, you know, letting tradition hold her back. In Cloaked in Courage, readers not only see Deborah Sampson making decisions, but they see how she made poor decisions in a few cases, which left her with another challenge to face. So, you know, there's the ups and downs of her journey, and she ends up blazing her own trail and proving that women make just as good a soldier as a man, you know. So, and Franz Selman in my latest books, he pursued his dream despite a lot of harsh judgment and criticism. And, you know, just seeing how someone perseveres opens the door for readers to rethink common assumptions and that believe that they too could do something. So really, they're models for kids, they're inspiration for kids, and I think they're kind of opportunities for kids to look at a wider world and sort of practice being deciders.
And, you know, something that Beth said is true for, as I call them, my dead woman in STEM, because they are all dead right now, but I have to change that name because I have a book coming out next year where she's not dead. But anyway, the obstacles that some of these people faced, they may not be the same obstacles that the kids are facing, but they're seeing that there's an obstacle, the person works through it and succeeds, or sometimes fails. You know, that happens too. But just seeing that it wasn't just, oh, it was so easy, you know, like some kids will think, you know, sports stars, so easy, you just grow up, you be a sports star or an internet influencer, no big deal. When I used to teach computer science, easily half the kids in the class, that was their career ambition, to be an internet influencer, because it was going to be a very easy thing to do. So kids need to see that there are obstacles, but that you can overcome these obstacles. And maybe you have to, you know, as I think Beth said earlier, think outside the box. In my Numbers in Motion, Sophie Kovalevsky was Russian. She wanted to study in Germany. She could not leave Russia unless she was married, you know, and going with her husband or her father. That was the way it was back then. And so she had a sham marriage. That was the solution she came up with in order to do it. You know, she found someone to say he would be her husband so she could go and study. So there are a lot of obstacles out there that are still obstacles. With Ada Byron Lovelace and the Thinking Machine, she wrote the first computer program. She signed it with her initials, not her name, because she knew if she signed her name, no one would pay attention to the fact that a woman had done it. So we like to think that some of these obstacles are no longer here, but we all know they are. So for kids to see that, yes, you can overcome obstacles, you can succeed, I think is just so empowering for them. And that's part of what we're doing with our books. Okay, so one last question before we get to questions and answers. Tell us about any books that are coming out soon. So, Beth.
Well, I mentioned a little bit about Deborah Sampson and Cloaked in Courage, but there's one coming out in 2023, and he's a mainstream figure, Thomas Jefferson. But it's about bias and truth and a mighty moose. So there's a lot of science in this, and it's about scientific inquiry and faulty reasoning, and basically how much misinformation, how much damage that can do. So I was so obsessed with, I've been so obsessed and I'm still obsessed with truth and misinformation. And this was a story where I could really lay it on the page. And, he fights for truth against the French scientist who badmouths all things North American. But when you read the back matter, you understand also that Thomas Jefferson had some bias to thinking himself. And so, it lays it all out that we all have to be critical thinkers. And I just think that's really valuable for kids to see that it happens to everyone. And we all have biases of some sort. So we have to be able to admit that and work with it and move past.
And I think that's a very important point, that we like to think that, oh no, I'm not biased. But of course, we all have implicit biases, some have explicit biases. Killa?
Well, I have No World Too Big, Young People Fighting Global Climate Change. It's a companion title to No Voice Too Small. It's a poetry anthology, also in collaboration with Lindsay Metcalf and Jeanette Bradley. And it features young activists climate activists from around the world. And it also has a call to action with ideas of what kids can do to help our planet heal. I also have, and that's in 2023, I also have in the summer of 2023, Yumbo Gumbo, which is part of the Charles Bridge Storytelling Math Series. It's a fictional story, but it's an intergenerational tale of a young girl who's excited about her first gumbo cooking lesson, but her family can't decide on what to cook until she finds a solution that makes everyone happy. But in my author's note, I do a little myth busting because I give the true, with receipts, story of the origin of gumbo.
Fascinating. Rita?
Okay, I have nothing coming out, but I have finished 2 middle grade novels. One just won a scholarship from Highlights for me to work with a couple of editors there.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes, I'm really excited about that one. And then the other one is with an editor, totally different editor, who is considering that for acquisition. But at this point, I have no new books coming out yet.
Well, that's the story of publishing. You just don't know.
Right.
I have actually several books coming out in the next few years. The first one is about Mariah Mitchell, who is an astronomer. That's coming out in March during Women's History Month, because just like African American History Month or Black History Month, whatever they call it, you can only learn about women in one certain month. Then I have a fiction picture book, historical, that takes place in 1918 on the Lower East Side. And we may remember what happened in 1918. There was a flu, and this little girl really wants to go to school, but she can't. She has to stay home and take care of her baby sister. So she figures out a way to learn. So even our fiction that we write often has this, social emotional learning, to use the buzz phrase, but just inspiration for children. After that, I have, actually, it's before that one, a book about Judith Polgar. She was for 26 years the highest ranked woman chess player until she retired from competitive play, the only woman to ever break into the top 8. And you might say, but what does that have to do with STEM? It's math. So I love that book. And then after that, I've co-written with another author a book about Kalpana Chawla, who is an Indian-born American astronaut, in her story. So, we just started, we write them because we love them. We have that passion. We want to learn more about these people. We want these people to inspire the children and to help make them better people without, beating them on the head and being didactic about it. So just a reminder, I think Karen put into the chat the link to our handout, but worst comes to worst, you can just Google Kidlit for Growing Minds and you'll find information about us and our books. So Karen, are there any questions that came up along the way in the chat?
No, I just had thought of one myself. You guys have all written picture books that are based on factual events. How much do you think the pictures play a part in telling those stories for young readers?
Beth, you want to go first? Because that's a good
Well,
question.
I think the illustrations just bring a whole nother layer with a richness that is not in the text. And, we try to do not just have the illustrations reflect the text only, but they bring so much more to it. In some cases, they add documents or lots of more historical objects or, so history context in there. But also, a picture book is such an art form that they're beautiful and they're creative. I mean, like the oldest student, the collage in there is just stunning that there can be so much emotion in collage. So I love looking at the art in any of these picture books because it's just, and sometimes it adds a realism, but it's just adds a whole nother layer of interest.
Keela, and I want you to mention your back matter.
Yes, I was going to show my back matter. Actually, my publisher has just agreed to make this a poster. A librarian had asked about making this timeline. I did not submit this timeline like this. This is the designer at Beaming Books who created this timeline. So it will be a poster and I will have it available for some giveaways. And it is truly a historical account of legal segregation and also how Victor had to navigate all the different laws and the different policies that the government put forth and events that also impacted the decisions he made about his God.
Rita, you have anything to add?
I do. I do agree that the illustrations help to add that realism while children are reading. Here is one of my favorite illustrations from that book. Now, yeah, I described when I was writing it, do I need to keep that up there? I described Mary and this struggle she had as she put everything she had into learning to read. But I thought the illustrations, which I did not communicate with Oge Mora at all until well after the book was finished. But I thought that illustration of this exhausted little old lady with a pencil in her hand and having written all of those sentences over and over, what child could not relate to that?
Right.
I mean, it took me back to my own childhood and my fingers cramping because I was trying to stay within the lines and write my name, etc. So the illustrations really do, they tell you picture book means you tell so much of the story with words, so much with pictures, but that is so true with all of these books that we write. You get a fuller picture. I mean, you're forming pictures in your mind, but you get a fuller, more aromatic picture to me with these illustrations.
And I
And the
finally
historical research that goes into our books.
Yes.
It's undeniable. I mean, illustrators add half the story, but the research that they have to do is as much or more than we do as readers.
And I finally remembered the name of my latest Woman in STEM book, so I can mention something about it. It's called Codebreaker Spy Hunter: How Elizabeth Friedman Changed the Course of 2 World Wars. And throughout the book, the illustrator put ribbons with letters on it, to indicate codes. And I said, how about if we put real codes in there? So I gave her real codes to put in there that kids can now decode. And I was, for a long time, really afraid that some 10-year-old would say, oh, you made a mistake there, with the code. So talk about adding richness to the book. Now there are codes in the pictures that the kids can get. And the other book I want to mention that I think the illustrations are really important. Give me a second and I will think of the title of that one. I don't know what my problem is today with titles of books. Oh, Hedy Lamar's Double Life. And there's a lot of science in Hedy Lamar's Double Life. In fact, I had to give the science to the illustrators so she could draw the frequency waves and things like that. So I'd like to believe that my words were clear enough that the kids could understand the science just by my words. But let's face it, seeing a picture of the frequency waves definitely helps in understanding. And especially for kids who may not be reading quite as well as others, those pictures help tell the story. So the pictures are great. And I think we've all been lucky with the illustrators that we've had. They've done a great job. They've added to the story so much.
Thank you guys so much for this discussion today. I am a junior high librarian, but I come from an elementary background, so I still use picture books with my students, and I encourage my teachers to use them.
Okay, I'm going to jump in on that one also, that picture books aren't just for little kids,
right,
especially the ones we're writing, the ones that are so filled with historical information and information about people and the time periods. Yeah, not just for littles.
Right, yeah. I did a whole lesson on picture books with my 7th and 8th graders this past year, and those were like, I had stacks with other types of books in it. Those were the ones they wanted to spend the most time with. They wanted to begin to finish them, and they'd look back at the pictures and look and see even more. So thank you for the work that you have all done on your current books, and we look forward to what's coming. I think we're out of time, so I appreciate you guys for being here. Participants